In this episode of the Toughen Up Leadership podcast, there is corporate unrest and animosity as we see all the firings and the layoffs and the crazy work trends that are being spread all through TikTok and YouTube. There is a battle brewing out there between the employer and the employee. Which side are you on? Is there really a difference? Well, in this episode, we are going to talk about 5 myths that you may have about that evil employer. Yes, that's right, 5 myths about evil business and how they're coming for your money and your children. No. But we're going to talk about these 5 myths that are being spread through social media, YouTube, Facebook, TikTok, and just make sure that we clarify a couple of points here and give you some context so that you are not going to be stuck in the stereotype. And that is the episode. Are you ready for this? Then let's toughen up, Buttercup. Hello and welcome to the Toughen Up Leadership podcast. This is Jason Kistler with Sapphire Leadership Advisors, and I am so excited about this topic today because I have been, obviously I watch a lot of videos on YouTube and I see a lot of stuff regarding business and corporate, et cetera, et cetera. And lately I've been seeing a lot of videos just really going after business in general based on a few bad actors. And so I wanted to make a point to dive into some of the, I would say, myths that are being spread around about corporations, business, employers, etc., that I think is important because it's really creating a rift out there between people who are being employed versus people who are the employer. And it's a shame because it's very easy to pile on to something when you've got a bunch of stories in the news about all the layoffs with Google and Microsoft and Meta and all those big tech companies. And we're moving into a recession, so a lot of people have had to make changes and let people go. So it's really easy for the people on YouTube and TikTok to just kind of pile on and say, oh, look at all the evil employers that are out there. They're horrible. Look at what they're doing. Well, a little secret, and it's not really a secret, but all those YouTube people and the TikTok people, most of them would be considered employers. They're creating businesses. And they most likely, especially some of the larger channels, they've got a staff of people. So it's very interesting when you become your own business owner and then rail against the practices of other employers, and you don't really share the full picture, the full story, the full detail behind a lot of the stuff that's going on. And I'm not going to defend a lot of the stuff that has happened out there with some of these big employers. And we're going to get into that in a little bit as to why there's a difference between those types of employers and other types of employers that I typically have gone after and that I would encourage anyone watching this video to focus more on. But we'll get into that. But I felt like it was important to talk about this because, like I said, there are a lot of people on social media who are really pushing this narrative of the evils of employers and corporations and businesses. And I've even gone as far as to go into some of the backstories of some of these individuals because they're fairly open about why they've come to this conclusion. And I'll even agree that they had a very bad string of luck going through the different scenarios that they went through, the different layoffs and terminations that they've had to deal with. And I get it. But I think it's important because there's a lot of younger, impressionable people that are watching this stuff and thinking that this is the way business is. And I feel like it's important to have a counter voice to say, no, that's not the way that all business is. Just like the evils of the nightly news is not the way that every single person is in the world. You have to take each individual with their own circumstances, and it's the same thing with businesses and employers. So, without any further ado, let's get into the 5 myths that you need to be aware of about the evil employer. Myth number 1. All employers are greedy, money hungry, and they don't care anything about you. So this is a pretty common depiction from, say, Wolf of Wall Street all the way back to Ebenezer Scrooge and Bob Cratchit as to the evil employer and the meager employee and the abuses that go on inside of the business. So this idea is nothing new. It's been entrenched in society for a very long time. But it's only half of the story in most cases. Now, this myth, as with any of the other myths that we're going to talk about, it's important to consider that there are actual scenarios that support this myth. That's why the myth is being spread so easily, is because you can look out in society and see these types of things happening. You can look out there and you can see layoffs, and you can see, people that are recording interviews that are horribly done, people that are recording firings that are horribly done, and these videos or audio recordings are making their way onto the internet for everyone to see that the employers are so evil and this is what they're doing. And so those are real situations, and I'm not suggesting that they're being fabricated in any way. But again, it's the overall assumption that all employers are that way that I'm trying to combat here. So I want to dispel this first myth with a personal story, because these are the stories that don't get told. They're not in the news because they're not sensational, but they're true nonetheless. So I was employed by a very small company as a software engineer, and this was a husband and wife, and they were building up a company from scratch. They had worked in the corporate arena, didn't like it because they felt like their decisions were better than the ones that were being made where they worked, and so they went off on their own to create their own company. And they brought a few people in. They needed some skill sets that they didn't have, or they wanted the ability to delegate so that they could do some other things. And they had a client or two that they brought in, and then things started to plateau, and they were losing money. And it got to the point where they were concerned about making payroll. Now, here's where the evil employer should step in and fire everybody and say, look, we don't have enough money to pay you guys, so long. Or maybe not even tell them and just, there's no paycheck that they're expecting. And then they find out when they come into the office. But no, that's not what happened in this scenario. What ended up happening was they went through and sold some of their own personal property in order to make the payroll so they could keep the people that they had, because it was important to them that they spent so much time finding people to fit the right culture that they wanted. And they took them in, and I know this is cliche, but they really did take them in almost like family. Now, there's one particular YouTuber out there, I'm not going to really mention any names because I don't want to get into any kind of mudslinging, but the idea that this person just laughs at any kind of team building activity or any kind of idea that there's loyalty or that people can be treated as a family in a business. And I dispute that wholeheartely, because I've been in that situation. I've worked for a business that's like that. And so they ended up really struggling for a while. And they refused. They had multiple opportunities to bring in outside capital from investors. They refused because they knew that that would then change the way that things are run, and they wanted to keep it the small, more intimate family type business. And so it just goes to show you that there are companies out there that will do that. Would you be able to see something like that in a large company? Probably not. And that's why in a later myth, I want to cover the difference between large and small companies and why that makes such a big difference. But I will say that this company then later on became larger, probably tripled the number of employees that they were able to hire, and ended up making a successful business and sold the business, sold the concept to a group of investors for multiple millions of dollars with the requirement that everyone that worked there was moved into this new company that was being formed by the investors as part of the contract. So, to this day, the people that chose to stay there are still there. Myth number 2. There is no loyalty. They don't care about you. Now, this one's interesting because I think it's important to understand or define loyalty before you can really question whether or not employers have this anymore. So my idea of loyalty from an employer is, really someone who makes a lot of focus around employee development. Because when you're an employee and you're working for an employer that has this focus, then they're building you up and they're helping you to improve. Now, granted, they benefit, yes, of course they do. The better employees that they have, the better work performance that they're going to have. But at the same time, the idea is, are they going to give this opportunity to internal or external people? So are they going to give you as an internal employee more opportunities than, say, someone who could potentially come in from the outside? So, maybe giving internal employees opportunities first to fill management or leadership positions before bringing in, outside help, whatever makes sense. But I think that the question of loyalty is one of those things where if you assume that loyalty is that you stick with someone regardless of what's going on, that's the more romanticized idea of loyalty. And it's kind of difficult for that to exist in a business because, essentially the business has to make decisions that keep the business alive. And so if the choice is between the business going under or letting a few employees go, then you have to make that detached decision to say, well, I have to do this. Now, the loyalty aspect comes in to play when an employer says, in my example before, we have to let people go, or what other alternatives do we have? Letting people go doesn't always have to be the only way that we could save money. So what other ways can we save money and keep the people that we have? To me, that's more of an aspect of employer loyalty. And again, I say that does exist. Now, on the flip side, employee loyalty is so horrible these days that how could you expect the reciprocation of, well, if an employee has no loyalty and will never stay, then the employer doesn't benefit from loyalty either because they're going to get burned every time. They focus on an employee, build them up, and then they take all that and they go somewhere else. And real quick, if you are getting any value out of this podcast, I would encourage you on whatever platform you're watching or listening on to go ahead and subscribe to the podcast and maybe leave a comment on your thoughts on the topic of the day. Myth number 3, employers love to fire people. I love to just watch them squirm in their seats. And now this one kind of irritates me a little because most of the people that rail against this idea of firing and how it's so easy and that all these corporations just fire for nothing have never actually fired anyone. So a lot of the people that whine about it, yes, they've been on the receiving end of being fired, and it's pretty crappy. So the important thing, and I've been on that end, I've been on the receiving end, I know what it feels like to be let go. And, but I also have been on the other side, and I've had to fire people. And I can tell you that nobody likes to fire anybody unless you're some kind of weird sadistic manager. Now, I've actually worked for a manager like that before who literally would keep the ID badges of everyone he fired in his drawer, almost like a trophy case. So yes, there are some really messed up managers out there. However, that's not the norm. And I have had another manager that I have worked for who had to fire someone who'd worked for him for a very long time. And he had given him every opportunity to improve, never happened. And finally, he made the decision to fire him. And he was literally sick all day. I mean, like vomiting type sick. Because it's not something natural that comes to people. You usually understand as a normal human being that you're affecting someone's life and that you shouldn't take that decision lightly. Most normal people are like that. Now, when you're in a large corporation, when you lose your soul as a large corporation, then it becomes what's the most efficient way to get rid of people, right? So it's a question of how do we get rid of people, and nobody wants to do the firing. So they come up with these cowardly methods of just locking people out of systems, getting a group call. I mean, this is the big thing now. I've never seen this before, but these group calls on Zoom where you have no idea why, and all of a sudden you're being let go by the CEO who's saying that, oh yeah, no, we got to let you guys go. As soon as you hang up, your access will be revoked, blah, 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 blah. That, and I've mentioned this before, this is a cowardly approach. And regardless of how difficult it is to fire mass amounts of people, that should be part of the consideration when you decide that that happens. If you make the decision as a business to say, I need to lay off 18,000 people, and then you come back with, well, crap, how are we going to do that logistically? That should be part of the thought process of saying, well, maybe we don't want to do this, or maybe we need to do this in a different way. Not, oh, let's come up with an easy way of just laying everybody off. However, like I said, that's not always the case. And most of the time, when you're in a situation where you're being laid off or having been let go, then you have to consider that that does weigh on the person who's having to do that. Now, yes, you could make the argument, well, my situation's worse because I'm the one that's actually being let go. Yes, but as I said, people are still emotional. Most managers are going to look at a layoff as, I don't want to do this. I don't want to do this, And in my situation, I've always come up with, well, is there, okay, let me back up just a second, because it does depend on whether this is a layoff or if this is performance-based. Performance-based terminations typically don't happen on scale. They're usually individuals who are not performing. They're well aware of what's coming. And so when you bring them into the office and you're finally having to let them go, most of the time, if you've done it correctly, they should be well aware of what's coming. But when it comes to layoffs, those things can be done, by surprise. You get a phone call in the morning that says, hey, I need you to lay off 10 people. We're making cutbacks, and you got to figure out how to do it. Those things are different, but I've had to do that before. I mean, COVID was a perfect example. I had to lay off where I was working almost my entire team. It was probably 85% of the people I had to lay off. It wasn't performance-based. It was the fact that the industry that I was in revolved around travel and leisure. Well, COVID put an end to all of that for a time period. And so we went from, several $100,000s a month of revenue coming in as a small business to nothing, literally nothing. So there are situations like that where I had to have I had an individual phone call with every single person. And I offered them whatever I could in terms of reference letters, in terms of helping them find another position. Because again, this is what the human in us should push us to do. Myth number 4, putting in extra effort and going above and beyond your job description only helps the employer, and it just lets them milk extra labor for free. So this one is really irritating because I feel like this is just a way of people saying, look, I'm just going to do what I was paid to do, and I'm not going to put any extra effort into the job. And so I just get these flashbacks of Office Space where I'm just doing enough work so I don't get fired. Just putting in the bare minimum effort just so that I don't get fired. So look at this from the perspective of a manager who needs to promote someone to another position, or wants to give an extra project to someone that would give them visibility to other departments, other higher managers, give them the opportunity to move up. And you've got a group full of people that are quiet quitting, right? They're just sitting there and they're doing the bare minimum, and then you've got someone who's making the extra effort. So of course you're going to gravitate to that person to give all the opportunities to. Why would I give it to someone who doesn't really care and is just kind of, okay, yeah, this is my job description, this is what I'm going to do. I'm not going to do anything extra. I'm not going to make any extra effort. And this is not the way that people get ahead. I mean, you can certainly go to a job. If that's all you want to do is go to this job and never get promoted and never get considered for anything else, then fine. Go in and do quiet quitting. Just sit in there, do your job, and go home. And that's your life. If you want to focus on things outside of work and not worry about getting any better or getting promoted or getting moved up, any of that stuff, go ahead. That's the best way to do that. But if you really want to move forward, if you want to get noticed, you want to have more opportunities, you want to expand your knowledge beyond what you're doing in your everyday workload, then let's dispel this myth now. There is no way that you are going to move yourself up to any kind of significant leadership or any kind of upper management position if you are simply doing the bare minimum. Now, I think where this comes into play, and this is almost everyone that I've heard, and this is anecdotal, so I'm sure it could be different in certain sectors, but I hear this a lot from technology workers. This is what they go in and they just want to do their tech job and they don't want anything else. They don't want to do anything else. They don't want to get promoted. They're not ambitious. They're hard workers. And that's fine. Those people are important just like the ambitious ones, because you need people to toe the line. You need to have people that aren't always focused on what the next position is that they're trying to get. They spend time and energy in the craft that they're doing. And it's good to have a mix of people like that, but you also still want to have people that are driven, because you eventually, as a leader and a manager, maybe you want to move up. And who are you going to put in your place when you move up? It's not going to be the one who's quiet quitting in the corner who wants everybody to leave him alone. Myth number 5. Large corporations and small businesses have the same amount of evil in their heart. So as often as I've referenced this throughout the video, I probably should have put this one as the first myth. But this is an important one to dispel, because I think this is where you're going to see a lot of the significant difference between how businesses are run. And keep in mind that, and I don't know the exact statistic, but it's got to be something like 80 or 90% of the businesses in the country are small businesses, less than 200 people, and maybe even less than 100 people. And so you've got this small percentage of the upper crust of all of the large corporations. And I will be the first person to jump on that bandwagon of, once you become a large corporation, too many times you lose the soul of the company. And that's just an unfortunate reality, that there's too many large businesses who they're focused on shareholders, not employees. They're focused on the wrong things. They get people in that take the company in crazy directions, or they bring investment partners in that change the complete culture and atmosphere of the company. And so I've always been a huge proponent of small businesses, because small businesses are the people like you or like me running a business, a small business, maybe 5 employees, maybe 10 employees. The mom and pop bakery down the street that hires or that employs maybe 4 or 5 people, or the the YouTuber. Even we talked about this before, the YouTuber who, they may employ 2 or 3 additional people. Maybe they have some virtual assistant outsourced, some 1099 employees, but it's small business, and that's the majority of what keeps the company going. And so the problem is when you try to conflate large and small businesses, then you're going to end up labeling the small businesses with the same type of problems and the lack of focus or heart or soul that a lot of large businesses have. Where a lot of times, if you look at a large business, you don't necessarily understand what they represent, what their values are, because they've become so entrenched in either politics or the crazy trends that when you get these huge HR departments that they only focus on what the latest work trend is. I mean, this is what I get, these emails from HR stuff all the time. It's talking about focusing on the latest trends and diversity and equity and inclusion and all this other stuff. And they don't focus on the vision of the company anymore, what the original purpose of the company was. It's all bureaucracy. And it becomes more and more government-esque as they get larger. And so I think the last myth for this episode is really going to be that when you're considering companies and how they treat employees, there's a huge difference in how they look at employees in a small business versus a large business. In a large corporation, I would agree that a lot of times you're considered a number and you could be let go at any point. Just some executive in a dark room in a tall tower somewhere decides that 500 people need to be let go so that the shareholders will be happy this month. That's the kind of behavior you are going to get from large businesses. Not all of them, but I would say probably the majority of them. But the smaller businesses, it's a little different, because those people they're working and they're interacting with the people whose lives would be impacted by their decisions. So they see every day the results of the decisions that they make. Whereas executives for large companies, again, in large corporate offices, multiple states away, they make decisions based on a satellite office, and they have no idea what impact it has. They don't even see the faces of the people whose decisions are affected, or whose lives are impacted by their decisions. So that is definitely, I would say, a huge consideration when you're looking at ethics and the evils of employers, is really small versus large corporate monstrosities. So don't forget that businesses are run by people, and people have the ability to be either unbelievably kind, empathetic, caring, and generous, or incredibly cruel, greedy, and money hungry. So just keep that in mind when you're looking at these videos and you're listening to all the people railing against business and how evil employers are and all these horrible decisions. Just remember, when you're looking at all that, to take that with a grain of salt and say, you know what? I know this person may have been hurt or repeatedly laid off or fired, and their personal story leads them to this conclusion. But don't make that your story.